The palace gates have never felt more silent. Behind closed doors, King Charles has made a decision that will reshape the British monarchy for generations, and it involves a date that no one saw coming. William's coronation isn't just about a crown. It's about a carefully orchestrated plan that places Catherine at the heart of a new era. But what role has she truly been assigned? And why does the timing reveal more than the palace wants to admit? Before we uncover what really happened, tell us in the comments. What do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about this story? It wasn't a grand public address. No fanfare, no gilded podium, no carefully staged broadcast from Buckingham Palace's opulent staterooms. Instead, the announcement that would send shockwaves through royal watches around the globe arrived in the form of a carefully worded statement, released at an hour when most of Britain was still finishing their morning tea. The timing itself was deliberate, calculated to land quietly, yet with undeniable precision. King Charles III, seated in his private study at Clarence House, had signed off on something that royal insiders describe as the most consequential decision of his reign to date. And yet, the public barely noticed the tremor beneath their feet. For weeks, speculation had swirled around the future of the monarchy, health concerns, family tensions, the relentless churn of tabloid headlines. But what Charles set in motion on that crisp autumn morning went far beyond the usual palace gossip. The announcement concerned succession, not in the distant, abstract sense that historians debate, but in a concrete, time-stamped reality that would pull the future king out of the shadows and into an entirely new role. William, the Prince of Wales, had long been prepared for this moment. Trained from childhood, shaped by tragedy, and hardened by public scrutiny, he stood ready. But what caught everyone off guard was not the fact of his ascension, it was the date attached to it. Sources close to the palace have since revealed that the king's decision was not made in isolation. It came after months of private consultations, medical evaluations, and tense family meetings that stretched late into the night. The palace machine, usually so polished and impenetrable, showed cracks of urgency that insiders had rarely witnessed before. One former aide described the atmosphere as electric with unspoken truths. And at the center of it all was Catherine. Her name appeared in the statement not as a footnote, not as a consort, but as an integral piece of the new order. The wording was careful, diplomatic, even, but those trained to read between the lines noticed something unusual. She wasn't simply being mentioned as William's wife. She was being positioned, elevated, given a role that, in the past, might have remained purely ceremonial. But now, it carried weight, responsibility, purpose. Yet for all the carefully managed messaging, one question remained conspicuously unanswered. Why now? The palace insisted it was a matter of planning, of looking ahead with clarity and vision. But critics and commentators quickly pointed to the timing, the king's age, his recent health battles, the quiet reshuffling of senior royal duties. There was a sense of acceleration, of a timeline being compressed. And in that compression, something else emerged, a story that the palace had hoped to keep buried. The relationship between Charles and William had never been simple. Behind the public displays of unity, there existed a complex web of duty, resentment, and unresolved emotion. William had grown up in the shadow of his father's ambition and his father's mistakes. He had watched his mother navigate a system that devoured her. He had learned early that the crown was not a gift, but a burden. And now, that burden was being passed with an urgency that suggested more than just forward planning. As the statement circulated through newsrooms and social media feeds, royal experts scrambled to interpret its deeper meaning. Some called it a natural progression. Others whispered of a constitutional shift. But those closest to the family knew better. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about power, about legacy, about who would stand beside William when the moment finally came, and who might be left out in the cold. The date itself remained ambiguous in the initial announcement, intentionally vague. But behind palace walls, the calendar was already marked. A date had been chosen, discussed, and sealed. And it was sooner than anyone expected. For Catherine, the announcement marked a turning point she had quietly been preparing for since her wedding day. She had always known that her role would evolve, but the specifics were never fully outlined. Now, with Charles's declaration, the shape of her future became terrifyingly clear. She would not simply be a queen consort in the traditional sense. She would be something far more active, a public face, a decision-maker, a force within the institution. But stepping into that light meant stepping away from something else. And the sacrifices, as those close to her have noted, were already beginning to take their toll. What the palace failed to mention in their polished statement was the tension that had simmered beneath the surface for years. The meetings leading up to this declaration were not harmonious. There were disagreements, heated exchanges, and moments where the future of the monarchy itself seemed to hang in the balance. And at the heart of those conflicts stood one person who had never sought the spotlight but was now being thrust into its brightest glare. The king's quiet declaration had changed everything. But the full story, the real story, had only just begun to unfold. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. The date landed like a stone in still water. May 6, 2023. A Saturday unusual for a coronation, which tradition had always reserved for weekdays. Queen Elizabeth's had taken place on a Tuesday. But Charles was rewriting the rules, and the choice of this particular date sent immediate ripples through royal circles. Because May 6th held another significance, one that the palace carefully avoided mentioning in their official statements. It was the birthday of Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor, Prince Harry's son, the grandson who lived across an ocean, the child of the brother who had walked away. Whether intentional or not, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The king was being crowned on the same day his estranged grandson turned 4. And in that collision of dates, the unhealed wounds of the royal family were laid bare for the world to see. Behind closed doors, the planning had been underway for months under the codename Operation Golden Orb, a blueprint so meticulously detailed that it rivaled military strategy. The Duke of Norfolk, the man who had orchestrated the late Queen's funeral, was tasked with staging the coronation. But unlike the grand spectacle of 1953, when 8,000 guests packed Westminster Abbey, this ceremony would be scaled back. The capacity would remain at 2,000. No ceremonial robes for the peers. No 3-hour service. Charles wanted something shorter, more modern, more palatable for television audiences. But the most significant change, the one that would define his legacy, had nothing to do with the ceremony itself. It had everything to do with what happened immediately after. Sources inside the palace revealed that William would not receive a formal investiture as Prince of Wales, the way his father had at Carnarvon Castle in 1969. Charles had knelt before the Queen, worn ceremonial robes, and sworn an oath of loyalty in a coronation-like ceremony. William would have none of that. The future king was determined to do things differently, to modernize, to make the monarchy relevant, as aides would later describe. And that refusal to follow tradition signaled something deeper, a rift in vision between father and son. But it was Catherine who stood at the center of the most delicate negotiations. The date had been chosen, the guest list debated, the logistics finalized. Yet behind the scenes, a quiet battle was being waged over the role she would play. The palace's statement had been careful, almost too careful in its wording. It spoke of her continuing support and important contributions, but it stopped short of defining the specifics. And in that silence, rumors began to swirl. One insider described Catherine as the power behind the throne, a phrase that carried weight far beyond its casual use. She was seen as the grounding force for William, the calm presence that kept him steady amid the storm of royal duty. But she had also privately expressed hesitation about stepping into a role that carried so much history. The title of Princess of Wales, which she had inherited from Diana, had come with reservations. She had reportedly expressed concerns to both William and Charles about taking on the title, conscious of the public's deep connection to Diana, even decades after her death. She was determined to find her own path, a former aide later revealed. And finding that path meant carving a role that was not merely ceremonial, not merely decorative, but one of genuine influence. Yet as the coronation date drew closer, whispers emerged that Catherine's preparation for her future role as queen consort had not been a priority for the palace. Some reports suggested that King Charles, who had spent his entire life preparing for the crown, was not in any rush to help his daughter-in-law navigate the transition. Others claimed that the lack of preparation was not personal, it was simply a matter of focus, of energy directed elsewhere. But those closest to the family knew the truth. Charles was not ignoring Catherine. He was carefully managing her, positioning her, keeping her close enough to shape, but far enough to maintain control. And then came the unexpected twist. The date of the coronation was not just about Charles. It was about William. It was about Catherine. And it was about a timeline that had been quietly accelerating since the moment Queen Elizabeth drew her final breath. The palace had hoped the transition would be smooth, gradual, measured. But the reality was far more complicated. There were forces at play that no public statement could contain: family tensions, health concerns, and the quiet maneuvering of a future queen who was determined to do things her own way. As the calendar turned toward May 2023, the question on every royal watcher's mind was not whether the ceremony would be beautiful. It was whether the family could hold together long enough to make it through. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. While the world focused on the king's crown and the date that had set the palace abuzz, a quieter but no less significant transformation was taking shape behind the scenes. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was preparing for a role that the official announcements had conspicuously left undefined. And in that silence, a carefully guarded blueprint was beginning to emerge. The coronation service at Westminster Abbey on May 6, 2023, was a spectacle of tradition and pageantry. The Prince and Princess of Wales sat on the front row, their 3 children beside them. But while William, as the heir to the throne, had a formal role in paying homage to his father, Kate's position was markedly different. According to royal correspondence at the time, the Princess of Wales was not assigned anything particularly special during the ceremony. She was, in many ways, a spectator. But that was the surface-level narrative. What those early reports missed was the deeper purpose behind her seemingly passive presence. On the day itself, Kate's focus was not on protocol, but on something far more strategic and far more personal. She was the steadying hand for the family's younger members, particularly Prince Louis, who at just 5 years old, struggled with the weight of a formal service that stretched well beyond his attention span. Photographs captured the moment, Kate bending down, speaking softly to Louis, her hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder as the congregation stood for hymns. This was no mere parenting moment. It was a masterclass in royal composure, a display of the stabilizing presence that William had long relied upon. Royal observers noted that while the future king focused on the solemnity of the occasion, fully aware that the next coronation would be his own, Kate managed the human element, the children, the nerves, the unpredictable energy of a young family thrust onto the world stage. She wore Queen Elizabeth II George VI festoon necklace, a subtle nod to continuity and a reminder that she was stepping into a legacy far larger than herself. Behind the scenes, however, the palace's handling of Catherine had been a subject of quiet tension. Reports surfaced that her preparation for the future role of Queen Consort had not been prioritized by King Charles's team. Some insiders suggested that the lack of a defined role at the coronation was not an oversight but a deliberate choice, a way to keep her influence in check, to ensure that the focus remained squarely on the monarch and his immediate heir. Others saw it as a sign that Charles, having waited a lifetime for the crown, was in no hurry to share the spotlight. But those closest to Catherine knew she was playing a longer game. The coronation was not the end of her journey. It was the beginning of her most important chapter. And the blueprint she was quietly following had nothing to do with the ceremony itself, and everything to do with what came after. Her role would not be defined by a single day. It would be shaped by years of careful positioning, of building a public image rooted in grace, empathy, and an unshakable commitment to the institution she had married into. The coronation also revealed another layer of the story: the family's fractured dynamics. Archie, Prince Harry's son, turned 4 on that same day. Yet, in the flurry of celebrations, no senior royal publicly acknowledged his birthday. The lack of a public tribute sparked widespread criticism, with commentators noting the painful symbolism of the king's coronation overshadowing his grandson's milestone. Charles did raise a toast privately, reportedly to those that weren't there and to Archie, wherever he was, but the absence of a formal gesture spoke volumes. For Catherine, the date's collision with Archie's birthday was impossible to ignore. She had long been viewed as a bridge between the warring factions of the family, a calming presence who could smooth over tensions. Yet even she could not mend a rift that had grown so wide. Her role in the unfolding drama was not as a peacemaker, but as a survivor, a woman who had learned to navigate the monarchy's brutal currents without losing herself. The coronation may have been Charles's moment, but as the cameras panned to Catherine, Seated in the abbey, her children beside her, her gaze steady and composed, something else became clear. She was not merely watching history unfold. She was shaping it, quietly, methodically, with a patience that would outlast any king. But the question that lingered long after the ceremony ended was this: what had the palace not told the world about the role Catherine would eventually play? And whose interest was she truly serving, the crown's or her own? If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. The coronation of King Charles III was a masterclass in royal pageantry, a carefully orchestrated display of unity and tradition broadcast to billions. But beneath the gilded surface, a fracture that had been quietly widening for years was on full display for those who knew where to look. The presence and absence of certain family members told a story far more complex than the official narrative. Prince Harry attended the ceremony alone, his wife Meghan choosing to remain in California with their children. The decision was met with intense scrutiny, but those close to the couple insisted it was born of practicality rather than protest. The Duke of Sussex was seated in the third row, far from the frontline positions occupied by his brother and other senior royals. The symbolism was unmistakable. Harry was present, but he was no longer central to the institution his family had built. Yet the most telling moment came not during the ceremony itself, but in its aftermath. May 6th, the date chosen for Charles's coronation, was also the 4th birthday of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, Harry's eldest son. The collision of dates was either a remarkable coincidence or a carefully calculated slight. The palace offered no public acknowledgement of the milestone, and the silence spoke louder than any statement could have. For Catherine, the tension was palpable. She had long been viewed as a bridge between the warring factions, a calming presence who could navigate the treacherous waters of family conflict. But even she could not mend what had become irreparable. The rift between William and Harry had deepened beyond the reach of diplomatic gestures. Their relationship, once inseparable, had become a study in carefully managed distance. At the coronation, William and Kate appeared composed and focused, their children in tow, their duty to the crown unquestionable. But the absence of any warm exchange between the brothers confirmed what insiders had long suspected. The bond that had once defined them was shattered beyond repair. Behind the scenes, Catherine had privately expressed her distress over the estrangement. She had grown up in a close-knit family, surrounded by love and laughter, a stark contrast to the formal, often cold world she had married into. She had hoped to be a unifying force, to soften the edges of royal tradition with warmth and authenticity. But the divisions she encountered were not hers to heal. William's loyalty to his father, his sense of duty, and his growing impatience with his brother's public criticisms had created walls that no amount of kindness could breach. The coronation, for all its splendor, had laid bare the monarchy's deepest wound, and Catherine, ever the consummate professional, had played her part with grace. But the price of that grace was becoming increasingly clear. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week. The coronation of King Charles III was meant to be a celebration of continuity, a moment when the ancient institution of the monarchy reaffirmed its place in a modern world. But for those watching closely, the event carried an undercurrent of something far more unsettling. The date itself, May 6, 2023, was not merely a calendar entry. It was a collision of family milestones that laid bare the fractures within the House of Windsor. May 6th was the 4th birthday of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, Prince Harry's eldest son. While King Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey, his grandson was thousands of miles away in California, celebrating without him. Harry attended the ceremony alone. His wife Meghan remained in the United States with their children, and he was seated in the third row, far from the frontline positions occupied by his brother and other senior royals. The symbolism was unmistakable. Harry was present, but he was no longer central to the institution his family had built. For the Prince and Princess of Wales, however, the day was a masterclass in royal composure. William knelt before his father to swear his loyalty in the homage of royal blood, a solemn moment that underscored the weight of his future responsibility. Catherine, resplendent in her royal Victorian order mantle, managed the family with practiced ease. Lip readers later revealed a telling exchange as the couple entered Westminster Abbey with their children. As William prepared to begin the long procession in his ceremonial robes, Catherine turned to him with a worried expression and said, just mind the gown." It was a small, human moment, a wife concerned about her husband's attire, but it revealed the immense pressure behind the scenes. William replied with reassurance, saying, "Don't worry, I got it." The service proceeded without incident, but the glimpse of anxiety spoke to the weight both carried that day. Yet even as the coronation unfolded, whispers of another transition were already circulating. Rumors of King Charles's health had been quietly growing, and palace insiders suggested that plans for William's eventual coronation were already in motion. The uncertainty surrounding the king's condition cast a shadow over the proceedings, a reminder that the crown William wore in the abbey that day was not merely symbolic but a prelude to a future that might arrive sooner than anyone expected. Behind the scenes, Catherine and William had already begun private planning sessions for their own coronation, discussions that palace sources described as training for the inevitable. Catherine, driving the preparation, was determined that when the moment came, both she and William would hit the ground running. The family was preparing for a transition that felt increasingly imminent. And so, as Charles sat upon the coronation chair, his face solemn, his voice steady, the question lingered: how much longer would this king reign before his son took his place? And what role would Catherine play in the new era that was quietly being prepared? If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week. The coronation of King Charles III was designed to project stability, tradition, and continuity. But what the carefully staged photographs and polished statements failed to reveal was a monarchy in quiet crisis. Behind the grandeur, a series of unanswered questions lingered, questions that the palace has since worked tirelessly to keep out of the public eye. The first was the date itself. May 6, 2023, marked not only the king's crowning but also the 4th birthday of his grandson, Archie Mountbatten Windsor. The palace offered no public acknowledgement of the milestone, and the silence was deafening. Whether intentional or coincidental, the collision of dates laid bare the family's deepest fracture, a wound that showed no signs of healing. Then came the seating arrangements. Prince Harry, attending alone without Meghan or their children, was relegated to the 3rd row, seated alongside his uncle Prince Andrew. The symbolism was unmistakable. The king's youngest son had been reduced to the status of a sidelined relative. He was not invited to appear on the Buckingham Palace balcony with the working royals, a tradition that has defined coronation celebrations for generations. For those who remembered the last coronation, when a young Prince Charles stood beside his mother, the contrast was jarring. But the most significant revelation came months later, and it had nothing to do with family drama. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles had been diagnosed with a form of cancer. The news sent shockwaves through a nation still adjusting to his reign. The king, who had waited a lifetime for the crown, was now facing a health battle that threatened to cut that reign short. The palace statement was carefully worded. He would continue state business and paperwork, but public duties would be paused. For a monarch whose identity was built on service, the blow was profound. And then, in a quiet but revealing development, reports emerged that William had already begun planning his own coronation. The Prince of Wales was not waiting for the inevitable, he was preparing for it. Sources close to William revealed that he envisioned a ceremony that would look very different from his father's, more modern, more relevant, stripped of traditions like the controversial homage of the people. He had already declined a formal investiture as Prince of Wales, signaling his desire to break from the past. "I think his coronation will look and feel quite different," one insider told The Times. "What the palace won't say, what it cannot say, is that the monarchy is in a state of quiet transition. Charles's reign may be brief. William's may come sooner than anyone anticipated. And Catherine, the power behind the throne, is already positioning herself for a role that will define the next era." The coronation was not an end. It was a beginning, one that may already be drawing to a close. But even as the palace guards its secrets, one truth remains undeniable. The crown is passing, and the family